a lot of what we've talked about at this conference, much of it very interesting, but a lot of it extremely intractable and difficult and depressing, right? There are a lot of really difficult questions, I think, at this moment we face in this country. What to do with modernity after the death of God, as Nietzsche and Dostoevsky both recognized, right? That, I can't give you an answer to that question. Even within the sphere of the subject of this panel, how we can make sure that the Academy remains dedicated to truth over lies while preserving the liberty that's necessary for us in our flawed faculties to actually seek the truth. Again, really difficult question that I can't give you an answer to. But I'm actually here to bring us much closer to earth. So no one in this room, and actually fewer and fewer people in the country, according to long-term surveys, imagines that higher education as currently constituted in the United States is such a creature that seeks truth over lies, right? The Academy is very simply our enemy, and the enemy of anybody who would preserve anything valuable about what America is or what it has been. If someone cannot bring himself to recognize this simple reality, he waffles about additions to the GDP, or continues to heap honors on the fake laurels of Harvard, he disqualifies himself, in my opinion, from any serious discussion about what should be done about the university sector in this country. But bringing the university system to heel is actually neither intractable, given the power of that system is so heavily dependent on the money we give it, nor is it particularly difficult in practice, as there exist a multitude of levers to push both legislatively and administratively that would get the job done. This particular institutional fight is actually easy in the sense that it requires no grand rewriting of political theory. It merely requires a clear understanding of what the university system is today, that and a minimally respectable backbone. I don't want to bore you with too much policy before I proceed to bore you with policy, but I'll just list some of the changes that could be made in that fantasy land where we imagine we had a competent Republican Party, brave enough to take the position that maybe they ought not to extravagantly fund people who make it their mission to destroy our country and now to throw us in jail. That is, this is after all America, right? We have the vision to dream of exotic and impossible things like landing a man on the moon using nothing but analog calculators and expecting Republicans to be somewhat responsive to the interests of their constituents. The starting point of any serious right-wing agenda in higher education should be to recognize that virtually all universities, with very rare exceptions like Hillsdale, are dependent on federal money and programs. First, there's the direct checks that we write, grants. Every day, hundreds of federal bureaucrats scribble out millions in grants to universities all over the country to study very important things like the sex lives of one-legged lesbians and the very objective and graphable trajectory of all of us in this room into fascism. But 1/8 of Harvard's funding overall and 2/3 of its research budget is made up of federal grants. Yale is pretty similar. It got about $700 million in grants from the federal government just in the 2022 year. So many less elite universities get similar amounts of money, by the way. This is not just a feature of the elite universities. Some of this cash is earmarked and specific by Congress. Some of it actually worthwhile, like research, funding cancer research. Much of it is not. But in any case, with so much legislation that Congress passes today, often the details are left to the army of unelected activist bureaucrats in the Department of Education and elsewhere to allocate. So let me propose a very groundbreaking idea. The next Republican administration should withhold that money from things that are bad and give it instead to things that are good. I know we're getting much higher on the fascism index, all the people that are getting funded at Harvard to study us. We're really falling off the index there, but there's no need to continue to give money to this kind of research. And in fact, we can impose some constraints of our own pretty liberally. There's quite a bit of power in the federal government currently to do that. But grants are just the tip of the iceberg in terms of cash flow from the federal government to universities, and the real money is in student loans. You see, if students actually had to go to a bank to ask for $150,000 to study queer theory, at least in the good old days of 1964, when LBJ first instituted these loan programs, banks would ask questions like, is the student likely to be able to pay back this money? Today, they probably wouldn't, if we're being realistic, right? They would just add it to the drag on their bottom lines, along with the unmeritorious portion of the 93% of new positions in 2020 and 21 in the corporate sector that went to people of color after our revolution in the streets. But nevertheless, initially this was a problem that politicians stepped in to solve, right, with the student loan programs now directly granted by government. So between these two things, direct grants and loans, universities are about as dependent on federal money as the average food stamp recipient, and Congress can attach whatever riders it wants to that taxpayer money. Several years ago, for example, there was a pathetic attempt to get universities to comply with already existing obligations under the First Amendment by attaching a rider to student loan eligibility. That failed because not enough Republicans voted for it, but then again, we're in this fantasy world where Republicans have some kind of backbone. So we can imagine any number of outrageous strings that could be attached: a requirement to dismantle DEI offices or grievance study departments, a cap on the ballooning number of fake work administrators on campus whose job is really political compliance, a requirement that universities prevent keffiyeh-clad future terrorists from physically preventing Jews from attending class. Any number of shocking examples I'll leave to your imagination of what Congress could actually attach to this money. But they're not the only branch that can use this lever. As I mentioned, the details of many of these grants are left to executive agencies and can be realigned. Civil rights enforcement also provides a tool to do this. It's one that's constantly used by Democratic administrations. Universities are constantly also saying how racist they are. We should take them at their word. We should vigorously enforce what is now Supreme Court endorsed colorblind interpretations of both the Constitution and of civil rights statutes to threaten university funding on the basis of racially discriminatory admissions and hiring. Trump's last administration played a little bit around with this, but it was primarily more for the media than a really serious threat of losing funding. This time around, they should be more serious about it, and they should start pulling funding. A new administration should also zero out recent administrative changes to Title IX, redefining sex, and granting Leah Thomas a federal right to peep in the girls' locker room, along with restoring college men's constitutional due process rights, not to have their lives destroyed by mere accusation after drunken trysts, and reversing unconstitutional restrictions on speech that are in those same 1,500 pages of Biden regs on Title IX. But if any of these or other attempts to reform are resisted by universities, the sanction of pulling funds and eligibility for student loans should be liberally applied. Which brings me to the only subject regarding higher education reform actually circulating in Congress and in the Biden administration: student loan forgiveness. The right has too often dismissed ballooning student loan debt as a pure issue of personal responsibility, and this old view does not account for the financial realities of our credentialing treadmill and the skyrocketing cost of tuition, up 200 and 300% respectively in public and private schools just in the last couple decades. By the way, as an aside, that credentialing treadmill, and by that I just mean the fact that the same jobs with the same salary now require a college degree when they didn't 20 years ago. It has a lot of causes, the heavy subsidization that I've been talking about being one of them, but one of the other causes is the fact that employers are forbidden by the 1991 Civil Rights Act and by the Griggs decision from implementing any kind of competency tests or direct screening of their applicants because this creates a disparate impact racially, right? College degrees also create a disparate impact, but the EEOC, which is the body tasked with enforcing Title VII, the first line of enforcement of Title VII, conveniently doesn't look at college degrees. That might be something actually for an administration to look into doing, because those also have a disparate impact. But in any case, the old view doesn't account for the fact that universities acquired their current gatekeeping position by relying on federally backed student loan programs, the grants I mentioned, an extensive policy ecosystem, privileging the four-year university track above all other routes to success. It has no room for the fact that there are virtually no private lenders in the student loan market, so 93% of loans are held or issued by the Department of Education now. Functionally, one way or another, we're all on the hook for these loans, whether or not we actually pass a bailout or whether one of Biden's many attempts to do so passes muster in the courts. And that's because we're the bank in this situation already. There are no private actors involved here. I mean, virtually none. So the fact that we, basically in short, this classic view of Republican economics has no contact with reality in the student loan context. And our refusal to acknowledge that fact and continually offering these kinds of anachronistic bootstrap-style solutions to the debt burden that millions of young Americans are under, all that's done is left an opening for the left to use the oldest and most effective trick in the demagogue's book, which is debt jubilees, right? This is antiquity, right? Since antiquity, very popular trick to get people to love you, right? Of course, if Democrats are structuring that debt jubilee, unlike Republicans, they're not shy about rewarding their friends and punishing their enemies. And the kind of debt forgiveness proposals that have been advanced by the Biden administration, by Bernie Sanders, by Elizabeth Warren, amount to a payout to the professional managerial class on the backs of the working class of Americans who mostly do not have college degrees. Because people from wealthier homes disproportionately, and actually contrary to the whole point of having these kinds of programs to begin with, right, increasingly are the ones going to college and incurring debt is people from the top half of the income spectrum. So any kind of taxpayer bailout will pay out about $7 to the highest earning quartile for every dollar paid to the bottom quintile of earners in America. So it's definitely robbing the poor to give money to the rich. But the real beneficiary of those kinds of bailouts are universities themselves. They can continue to up the price tag for attending woke madrasas without an end in sight, without any reevaluation of the value of the product that they're offering, and they just rely on back-end bailouts or worse, quote-unquote, free college, right, to pay up front. They're getting those checks day one. It's the students that are stuck with the debt and the taxpayers who are stuck with the bill. Fortunately, if one cuts the tie at the hip to libertarian economics on the right, and recognizes that universities are in fact our enemy, there's a perfect and elegant solution staring us in the face, which is to tax universities to pay student loan debt. Universities, despite claiming nonprofit status, are decidedly not poor as a sector. Yale's endowment is one of the top 10 largest hedge funds in the country, if it were counted as a hedge fund. University of California system is one of the largest landowners in the country. It's true that that kind of wealth is not evenly distributed throughout the university sector. We also have many more universities than we could possibly need in more than comparable European countries because we so heavily subsidize this and pay it through student loans. But in any case, almost all of them, even the richest, are sucking off the taxpayer teat, and there's no reason that we should treat them as these sort of perfect libertarian actors in the market. A modest initial proposal would be to tax university endowments like the hedge funds that they are, for states to tax the very large and tax-free property holdings of universities as though they were any other business. There's also some minor loopholes to close, like those permitting university research departments to charge taxpayers extraordinarily high rates, much higher than they charge private sector requests. Exempting themselves from various other kinds of taxes, right? This is actually something that the left has had a long problem with in college towns. Frequently, there's a big fight between the municipal government and the university because so much land is untaxable and taken by the university. So these things are not impossible. Who can object to these fat cats, right? Paying their fair share, as we're always told. This is my initial offer because, as you can tell, I'm a prudent and moderate person. I'm sure all of you are too. Next on my list is expropriation of university property, and after that is salting the earth. So, you know, this is my very moderate and reasonable proposal of how to deal with universities. None of these things, by the way, as I mentioned at the outset, are radical or difficult. They don't require breaching the borders of properly understood liberalism, which I know is a great topic of philosophical conversation in this conference, and I have views about it myself, but it's actually irrelevant in this context. These are all very straightforward political propositions that are not outside of the bounds of liberalism. I know that sometimes these kinds of proposals are characterized by the David French types on the right as illiberal. They seem to have some confusion about actual democratic control and democracy, that is, democratically elected bodies, political bodies choosing those institutions and behaviors they will subsidize with our money that is raised through taxpayer funds. This is a confusion strangely common among people who are constantly whining about democracy and threats to democracy, but I'm sure you've seen that in other contexts. And as I mentioned at the outset, long-term surveys show that Americans are completely breaking faith, rightly breaking faith with universities as institutions. They actually understand that the two products, primary outputs, if you will, of the university system in this country are student debt and cultural revolution. And so a lot of these solutions are likely to be popular. I, for example, had a lot of success convincing, I went on Dr. Phil, of all places, to talk about the student loan crisis with a bunch of students who had heavy student loan debt. And by the end, half of them were completely on board. These are all like left-wing students with having universities pay for the debt. So, you know, imagine sort of being the side that gets to hand out the debt jubilees and the Gibbs for once, right? So these solutions are likely, I think, to be popular if they're advanced by the Republican Party. They treat our enemies like our enemies and our friends like our friends. They solve some pressing political problems that are not going away. The student debt crisis is not going away. We're likely to see successive attempts to solve that student debt crisis by taxing deplorables and giving money to the managerial class if we don't advance our own solution, in my opinion on this. So I'll just wrap up and say this. There's a lot, like I said, about our political situation that does really require that we engage in sort of a deep rethink about a lot of the premises of liberalism, what Paul Gottfried yesterday talked about on a great panel about the fact that we live in a post-liberal world, actually, and all of these like sort of debates about what the boundaries are to what's appropriate politics. There's a lot of really difficult questions to be answered when we live in this kind of world in which the Rubicon, frankly, seems as heavily trafficked in the last few years as the Rio Grande. Those are usually the kind of questions I think confronted by the people in this conference. This actually isn't that hard. This is actually easy, and all it requires is balls. And that's the end of my pitch on this. So.